In this video, we will see how to use Azure DevOps REST APIs and fetch the repository and pipeline details from Azure DevOps Portal using REST APIs. So we will create a .NET Core application where we will use a personal access token in Azure DevOps and a Nuget package to fetch the repository and pipeline details. And here are the prerequisites. So you must have an Azure account and basic understanding of Azure DevOps Portal. And if you want to see the documentation, so here is the link of the Azure DevOps REST APIs documentation. I'll share the link in the description of the video. So let's create a .NET Core application now. Before creating .NET Core application, so here is the demo project AZ in my Azure DevOps portal. And here are the repositories. So we will fetch the details of these repositories through REST APIs. And similarly, we will fetch the details of the pipelines. So here I have two pipelines. So we will fetch the name and link of the pipelines through REST APIs. So let's create a new .NET Core application in Visual Studio. So I'll select an ASP.NET Core web app. Let's name it Azure DevOps API. Click Next. Select .NET 5.0. We will not configure it for HTTPS and click Create. Now go to app settings.json. So we will create two keys here. We will specify the value later. And second, we will specify the key for a project name. So our project name from Azure DevOps is demo project AZ. So I'll copy this and paste it here. So just save it. Now we will create a personal access token in Azure DevOps. Now we will create a personal access token in Azure DevOps. So here I am logged in into my Azure DevOps portal. So we will go to personal access token and click on new token. We will name the token as Azure REST token. Keep the other values as it is. If you want, you can select individual items for permissions here. For now, I will select full access and click on create. Click here to copy the token value. We will use this value in our app settings.json. Now paste the token here that we have copied from Azure DevOps portal. And now we will add the Nuget packages. So the first package that we require is the Microsoft Team Foundation Server.client. So this package will help us in providing classes and methods to send the request and fetch the response from Azure DevOps REST APIs. So I'll go ahead and add this. Another package that we need is Newtonsoft.json. So add this also. Now, after adding these two Nuget packages, let's add a class which will have the methods to fetch the data from the Azure REST APIs. So I'll create a new folder called services here, and inside this folder Let's add a new class. So we will call this class as Azure DevOps Manager. This is a plain C# class. So first I'll define a constant string for storing our DevOps org URL. So our DevOps org URL we can get from here. So this would be our Azure DevOps organization URL. So I'll copy this and add this here. And then now since we have defined the Azure token and project name in our app settings file, so we will need to fetch those details from through the configuration object. So I'll add a constructor here, and in that constructor I'll pass the iConfiguration. So let's add the namespace here using control dot. So for this I'll create a field also. So I'll rename it as _config. Okay. And now let's add couple of methods to fetch the token and project name from app setting. So here I have added two methods. One is getTokenConfig to get the Azure token value defined in the app settings.json. Similarly, we have fetched the project name from the app settings.json file. Now let's add a method that will authenticate our request to the Azure DevOps APIs. And this will return a VSS connection. So to add this, we will import this library. So this is coming from the Nuget package that we have added earlier called Microsoft.TeamFoundationServer.client. So I'll add the using statement here. Now let's define a variable for token and another variable for project name. Now we will create a variable called credentials. So this would be new VSS basic credential. For the first parameter, we just have to pass string.empty, and for the second parameter, we will pass the token. So for VSS basic credential, we have to add another using statement. So I'll add this. Now let's create a connection variable. So this will define our new VSS connection. So here we will pass our DevOps organization URL. So I'll create a new URI. And I'll pass the credentials. Now we will return the connection object from here. Now let's create a new method that will return the list of Git repositories from our Azure DevOps portal. So I'll define a new method that will return a list of Git repository. So this Git repository class is also coming from the Nuget package that we have added earlier. So let's name this method as getGit repos. So first we will create an object. So this will contain our authentication token. And then we will define a Git HTTP client. So this HTTP client is again coming from the Team Foundation server Nuget package that we have added. So this will be con.getClient. and as a generic parameter it will take as get HTTP client. So here we will call the method to get all of our repositories. So get client dot get repositories async dot result. We can also use await here, but since we don't have that much repositories, so I'll use dot result, and we can just return all repositories object from here. Now we will create a .cshtml page to display the data. We will use index.cshtml to display our data and the list of repositories that we get from Azure DevOps. For that, we will call get repos method on index.cshtml page. So I'll first create a list of get repository here and add the using statement. Let's call it repositories. So this list will hold all our repositories, and we will use this as a model for our CSHTML page. Now to call the get repos method, I'll use dependency injection. So for that, let's extract the interface first. Hit OK. So this will create a new interface inside the services folder. It only has one method for now. Now we will have to add this dependency in our startup class. So I'll go to startup, and in configure services method, I'll add services dot add transient I Azure DevOps Manager. This is the interface that we have created and the implementation class. Now in index.cshtml.cs, we can just inject this. Let's add the using statement. Let's call this DevOps Manager, and let's add a field for this also. So I'll rename the field as underscore DevOps Manager. Now in onGet method, let's populate our repositories object. So repositories equals to underscore DevOps Manager dot get repos. Now in index.cshtml, I'll delete this default div, and I'll add this div. So here I have just added a div. I've used the bootstrap CSS classes for container and row, and I've created a table, and inside that I have just created a header for table. So if I run this now and place a debugger here, so we can see that we are getting the 3 repositories that we have in our Azure DevOps. So here we are getting the name and the URL of the repositories. Now let's display this data on our CSHTML page. So for that, below the header, I'll use a for each loop, and we can use our repositories model. We will use model.repositories, and inside this, let's create a row. And for displaying our repository name, let's create a column. We can use item.name to display the column name, and for displaying the URL, we will use anchor tag. So in href, we can call at item.web URL, target equals to underscore blank, and again use item.web URL to display the URL. Now let's run this again. Hit F5. So here, as you can see, we have successfully fetched the repository name and repository URL. So if I go to this link, it will redirect me to the Azure DevOps portal. If you are already signed in, it will show the repository. Otherwise, you have to sign in into your Azure DevOps portal. Now to fetch the pipeline details, let's create a model first. So I'll add a folder here called models, and inside model, let's create a new class for pipeline model. So I'll name it as pipeline entity. So for first property, I'll name it as string name, and second property would be the URL of our pipeline. And in the interface, let's add a new method which will return a list of pipeline entities. Let's add the using statement and name the method as getPipelines. Now let's implement the interface to add our newly added method for getPipelines. So here, first let's define a list of pipeline entity. Let's call it pipelines. And I'll first define a variable for token format, which is string.format. So for first value, I'll pass as blank, and for second value, I'll pass the token using the getConfig method. Similarly, let's create a variable for credentials. It will be convert.to base64 string. Let's add the using statement for ASCII encoding. .ASCII .get bytes, and here let's add our variable token format. Now to call the pipelines using REST API in Azure DevOps, we don't have a built-in class like we have for Git HTTP client. So we will use API/pipelines method that Azure DevOps provides. So for that, let's define a HTTP client. So client equals to new HTTP client. Let's add the using statement for this. So I'll first define the base address for client. It will be new URI, and here we will define our DevOps organization URL plus the project name that we have defined in our config file, and plus let's provide a / here. Then we have to provide the authentication token in headers. So for that, first we will clear the default request headers. So here I have cleared the accept header, and I'll add default request headers .accept .add new system.net .http .headers. .media type with quality header value. Here I'll define the accept header as application/JSON. And for authentication, I'll define client.default request headers .authorization equals to new system.net.http headers .authentication header value. So here for the first parameter, we will pass basic, and for second parameter we will pass the credential variable. Now let's define the HTTP response message. And now we will call our Azure DevOps REST API for getting the pipelines details. So for that I'll call client.get async, and here I'll define underscore API slash pipelines dot result. So here again we can use await, but since we don't have that much pipelines, so I'm using dot result. So APIs slash pipelines is the REST API that is provided by Azure DevOps that we can use to fetch the pipeline details. So now we just have to check the response if it is successful. Then I'll define the JSON result to hold the result data. So it would be response.content.read as a string async.result. For deserializing this JSON result object, we have to use expando object. So I'll explain that now when we will debug this method. So for now, let's define a dynamic variable. So in this deserialized variable, we will use JSON convert.deserialize object method from newtons of JSON to deserialize our JSON result data. So I'll use JSON convert. Let's add the using statement dot deserialize object. Here I'll define the expando object. And for the parameter value, I'll define the JSON result. And for serializer settings, we will define the new expando object converter. Let's add the using statement for this. The reason for using expando object is since in this JSON result we will get various values related to pipelines, and we haven't defined those properties in our model object. So in our model object we only have name and URL, so we cannot deserialize the JSON result directly into our model object. So that's why I have used expand object. It would be more clear when we debug this method. So now we will loop through the deserialized JSON object. For each variable item in deserialized JSON dot value. So here we have to cast it into enumerable of type dynamic. And then we can populate our entity object here. So I'll create a new object of our pipeline entity, call it entity equals to new pipeline. So for name, I'll populate it as item.name, and for URL, so in the JSON result we get the URL under item.underscore links.web.href. Now add this object in our pipelines list. And at last, we will return the pipelines. Now let's add a CS/HTML page to display our pipeline data. So I'll add a new Razor page here. Let's add an empty page. Call it pipelines. So here I'll add a div structure that I have already prepared. So in this div I have a container, and inside that container I have defined a table. So we will display the pipeline name and the pipeline URL that we are fetching from our getPipelines method. So for that, we will define this model.pipelines in our cs.html.cs page now. So let's go to the code. Here before our onGet method, let's define the model. So public list of pipeline entity. Let's call it pipelines. Let's import the using statement for list. And as we did for our index.cshtml page, I'll define a constructor here and inject the AzureDevOpsManager. Let's call it DevOps Manager. Let's define a field also. I'll rename it as _DevOps Manager. Now inside onGet method, we can just populate our pipelines object. Pipelines equals to _DevOps Manager dot get pipelines. Now to open our pipelines CS.html page, I'll add a link in our layout master page. So in layout.cshtml, I'll replace the /privacy with /pipelines, and let's add the text also as pipelines. So this will show in our navigation bar. Now let's run this application. So here we are getting a compilation error. Instead of item.url, we have to use capital URL. Now let's run this application. And before running the application, I have put breakpoints on the getPipelines method. Now let's run the application. Now let's go to pipelines. Hit F5. Let's check the success code. Okay, it is false. Now let's check the error. Now I have debugged the application earlier, so I know the issue is in base address. So here, after the DevOps org URL, we have to pass a /. Now run the application again. Now let's hit F5. Now this time we got the success code as true. So now we are getting the data here. So I'll check the deserialized JSON object now. Here if we check the result view, so this is the reason that we have to use the expando object, because here we are getting these different properties from Azure DevOps pipeline APIs, and we haven't created these properties in our model. So to map the JSON result to our deserialized object, we have to use expando object here. Now continue. So here we are getting again an exception. So let's check the error. Here we are getting the error in the name property. So let's check the value in the item object. So for name, we have small n instead of capital N. So I'll change that. Now let's run the application again. Go to pipelines, hit F5. And now we are getting the pipelines data in the form of pipeline name and URL. So if I click the pipeline URL, it will redirect me to the pipelines page in the Azure DevOps portal. So we have successfully fetched the pipelines and repository details from Azure DevOps using APIs. Thank you for watching the video. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.